Welcome to Inspire Campfire, a podcast where ordinary people tell their stories of extraordinary adventure. These are campfire stories meant to inspire the rest of us to light the fire within, get outside, follow our dreams, and return to tell our own stories. Ready? Let's strike the match.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Scott Wurzbacher, and today we'll hear the epic story of someone who decided to leave everything behind to find purpose, adventure, and love by crossing Australia from coast to coast with 5 wild camels. Sophie Matterson from Flinders Ranges in South Australia is with us today. Back in 2016, Sophie took what she thought would be a short break from her real job in TV and film and found herself caring for camels. 4 years later, after turning 30, she set out on an unbelievable 13-month journey from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, crossing through the heart of the arid Australian landscape. Sophie is the award-winning author of the book that tells the story, The Crossing, a memoir of love, adventure, and finding your own path. I just finished reading it yesterday, and I am absolutely thrilled to share this story with you all today. Sophie, welcome to the campfire.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited. I have just devoured your epic story of crossing Australia with these unbelievably charismatic 5 camels. I can't wait to share this. I think I just like to dive right in. Can you just, for listeners that might be unfamiliar with your story, tell us about this epic journey that you took?
Well, it's funny. I was just listening to your intro, just thinking, oh my goodness, this is the best someone's ever summed up my journey. I felt like I didn't have to explain. In all the years that I've been asked, to sum it up, I thought, I've never done that well. But anyway, I'll try and give you probably a more rambling version than yours, Scott. But so basically in 2020 and 2021, I decided I wanted to go on a big epic adventure. It was I had just turned 30. I was facing that time in my life where, a lot of my friends were settling down, having families, and I just felt that I wasn't quite ready for that yet. And I wanted to do a long adventure. And at the time, like you had mentioned, I had got into working with camels, and I just found them such fascinating animals. And I just thought, what a perfect way to go on an adventure with these amazing animals. And it's also the perfect vehicle for Australia in a way, because they're so well adapted to our landscape, which is very, very arid. So I really loved the idea of doing something where I didn't have any support. I didn't have a support vehicle. It was just me and the camels. And so in 2020, I set off from the coast of Western Australia, about midway down the coast, which is the widest point of Australia. And I walked 4,750 kilometers all the way across the center of the country to the east coast, and Byron Bay on the east coast, which is the widest point on that side, the most easterly point. So that's sort of my journey in a nutshell.
Oh my gosh. What, where to even begin? Could you talk about, especially a lot of our listeners are US based, the landscape and the regions that you cross when you're going from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean?
So just I guess another thing to mention is that there was no track I followed. There's no set trail that goes across the width of the country. So I really, I just had to make up my own track across. So much of Australia is very, very arid. I'm talking like Joshua Tree, Death Valley, sort of arid. So really right from the beginning, I was stepping into that kind of landscape. So once I left the ocean in WA, it was pretty much dry for, 98% of the trip.
Wow.
Is that kind of landscape. And mainly I was crossing through big cattle stations. Sometimes they would have water points for the cows out there. So there would be vehicle tracks that they would take to go and check those water points. So I would walk some of those sort of smaller, less used vehicle tracks across people's land. And when I'm talking, the cattle stations there, I guess sort of similar to your ranches in America, but some of these ones are 1 million acres. It's an incredible amount of land. And beyond those sort of tracks, there's people don't set foot, besides the cattle, people don't set foot on those trails. So when I went, off those tracks, it was still very, very remote. And then I did actually start crossing proper desert. So that's desert that was under native title, so owned by First Nations communities, Aboriginal communities. I crossed the Great Victoria Desert, the Strzelecki Desert, and that's a lot of beautiful rolling dune country. The deserts are very varied, and everyone sort of thinks of them as these. Everyone sort of imagines, when they think of desert, they imagine the Sahara Desert, where it's just sort of empty sand dunes. But actually, our deserts in Australia are highly vegetated. So there's a lot of just arid adapted plants there, and it's very beautiful in its own right.
Yeah. I looked at a lot of the picture you did. The book has a lot of great imagery and some pictures and things. Like, there's a lot of red in the deserts.
Yeah. So we have a lot of iron ore in our soil here, and and that creates that beautiful red sand dunes. It's and that red contrasted against that massive blue sky. It's just it's phenomenal for taking photos.
Yeah, it reminds me of the North Carolina red clay that we have here in my hometown, but not quite as dry there as the desert. So I guess, with it being that arid and just so vast, I'm curious, like, how many days of supply do you have at any given time? Like what were the longest stretches where you're completely self-sustained?
So I carried 2 food boxes on my camels. So my camel Mac used to carry those, and one either side of him, and I could pack about a month's worth of supplies in there. I could stretch that. I did sort of at one point stretch that to about a month and a half. So about a month and a half worth of food, and then I had 12 jerry cans of water for myself, basically. And so I carried no food for the camels. They would eat just along the way, whatever vegetation was around. And I did give them a little bit of my water supply at times when it was really tough in the desert. But there was a stretch right in the center that was probably the most remote area that I crossed. It was about 750k of I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in miles. I should have translated it for you guys.
No, it's okay.
And that was about 750k with no water. So I ended up having to rely on one of the Aboriginal communities out there to come and drop water. Not so much for me, but more for the camels. They can go a long, long time without water, but I was worried that was maybe pushing them too far.
750 kilometers carrying your own water.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah. So like I said, it's, the fact that camels are so strong, you're able to carry this much gear and be self-sufficient. Like, I can't imagine ever packing, a month's worth of food on a bike packing trip or a hike. So that was just incredible to be able to be out there in the wilderness, and on my own, just to be able to rely on these animals.
So is the number, is having 5 camels a strategic number?
Not really. I actually, to be honest, I probably had more than what was necessary for just me.
Okay.
It sort of just came about. Right at the beginning, when I was sort of planning the trip, I actually thought that I might have some friends come along with me. Turns out I was the only crazy one that wanted to do such a long adventure.
Yeah.
And I sort of had the 5 camels, and I was training them by this point, and I sort of thought, I'm just gonna carry on with them. And it was nice because they were young camels. They were still big, but they sort of hadn't reached their full size. and I was able to just distribute the load on their backs so that, they didn't have to carry as much gear. My little camel Charlie, when I say little, he's actually massive now, but in my head he's still sort of a little boy. He was the smallest, and he carried about 40 kilos, which is absolutely nothing. It's like what an army guy would carry on their backs. So I always say he came for like a joyride across the desert with me.
Yeah. Well, so the thing that's cool about this, I mean, with 5 camels and their capacity to carry pretty heavy loads, I mean, you're essentially hauling an entire camp with you everywhere you go. It's not you're
Oh,
not this is
definitely.
backpacking. I mean, you've got
Yeah.
a pretty good supply of the things that you need.
Yeah, absolutely. The lot. Yeah. I mean, I look back on it now, and I've since done, some backpacking trips. I did a trip on some postie bikes, and I thought, geez, why did I carry so much stuff on the camels? I really didn't need that much stuff. But
Yeah.
just the water. The water is the main thing, like 12 jerry cans worth of water. That does get you a long, long way.
Yeah. I mean, just to help like paint a picture, like what are some of the things that you carried to sort of create your nightly camp? And what is that like packing and unpacking look like when you're
Yeah.
setting up camp each day?
Absolutely, yeah. So for sleeping in at night, I didn't pack a tent. I packed what's called a swag. They're a
Mhm.
very common thing in Australia. It's kind of like a big bedroll, basically. Most people camp with them if they're going car camping. They've got like a nice comfy mattress, and then they've got a bit of canvas that goes over the top of you. So I had that up on my front camel. And I packed some tarpaulins that I would put in the ground, and that would become my kind of little home away from home.
Yeah.
And I would line up all my pack bags along the back of that tarp. And in those pack bags, I would have, I mean, there's so many just in case items. Of course, like, you pack clothes, you pack food, you pack water. But then there's all those items like, just in case one of the saddles breaks or the halters breaks, you need all the equipment for sort of fixing those on the road. Because I was, pretty much the whole trip, I didn't go through any major towns, tiny, tiny outback towns I visited. But nothing that would have even, a lot of places didn't even have a proper grocery store. So I had to have all those just in case items, medical stuff just in case one of the camels hurt themselves, medical stuff just in case I hurt myself. So a lot of bits and pieces like that. And, and then your safety gear. I carried a sat phone, just in case for emergencies. And, and then the food and the water. And basically, I mean, it takes a long time. You're talking about the packing and unpacking.
Yeah.
That was definitely an art that evolved over time, because it's really quite a time-consuming process to pack camels to set off walking every single day. You've got to make sure that the loads are evenly balanced on their backs, and that they're sitting right and everything. So at the beginning, I think the first day I set off, it took me about 2 hours of putting that gear on their backs, and it was just hell. I thought, God, if it's going to take me this long every single day, this is going to be horrendous. And I think by the end I got it down to about 45 minutes. It was kind of like my real gym workout every day. So it's quite a process loading them. It's definitely not a quick departure from camp.
Most of the time solo. Occasionally you had some visitors that helped.
Yeah, occasionally I had some visitors that helped, and I'd get into sort of a team thing packing. But yeah, pretty much most of the trip solo.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have so many different levels of question just about the trip itself, but I'm curious, like, about the range of emotion that you experienced, like kind of like on a daily basis. Like, what was like a typical, I'm sure that in 13 months, you experienced every single kind of emotion there possibly was, but like, was there a sort of a common like state of emotion throughout this trip, or did it kind of change over time?
No, it changed a lot over time. I think I remember the early days, going back to the packing, there was a lot of anxiety when I started.
Yeah.
Huge amount of anxiety. I mean, there was the sort of initial, I guess like any adventure, there is so much planning, and this is often not talked about, but there's so much planning that goes into even before you set off. So you feel like in some ways you've run a marathon before you even take your first step.
Yeah.
There's just forever to-do lists, buying all of the food supplies, getting all the equipment together, making sure you know how to, set up your shelter, making sure all your equipment works, training the camels. All of that was probably a good year in the making. And then so when I first reached the ocean in WA, it was just this immense sense of actually pride and relief that I had actually even made it to the start line to begin with, and it was just such a beautiful setting. I mean, the water there is, crystal clear, and I tied the camels up to a bush and I went for a swim, and and I also got them sort of wading in the water. It was the first time they had ever seen the ocean. And but then that beautiful day departing, it was very closely followed by a lot of anxiety, and that was sort of around making sure that the gear was loaded right. What happened if I was so worried, what happened if one of the girths broke and the saddle fell off and spooked the camels, or constant sort of lists of visualizing what might happen if everything went wrong. And it got to the point where I obsessed over it so much that I used to do this thing where I'd get up in the morning and I'd just state all my worries. I'd spend about half an hour walking and talking about everything I was worried about. And then I said to myself, okay, after half an hour, you've got to just let this go. You've got to let it go, and you've got to keep on walking and get on with your day. And in those first months, I was very regimented. I was really kind of like, you've got to get up at this time. You've got to roll up the swag, get all your gear. You've got to set off. We've got to do this number of Ks per day to reach, to be able to be on track for reaching our destination. And the first couple of months, everything went wrong. Western Australia was in the grips of a really bad drought. So there wasn't much food for the camels. The camels were getting tired. They were getting skinnier. The terrain I was traversing was really tricky. They were also as well, like you mentioned at the beginning, I trained them from wild camels. And so they had only been a year out of the wild. So they were sort of fresh and spooky, and everything used to terrify them. And when you have 5 750 kilo animals bolting up behind you, it's pretty nerve wracking. And it's amazing that such big animals can be, they were as scared as mice. Everything would spook them. So that sort of then added to my anxiety, and it took a long time to sort of move past that and get to a point where I actually really started to just chill out and relax and enjoy the journey, and I started to live a lot more in the moment. And I think that just came really probably partly with us all being out in the bush for a long period of time, us all sort of quietening and starting to sort of become more in tune with the environment around us. And it got to the point sort of late in the trip where like I didn't care. I stopped caring how many Ks I did every day. All that mattered was that we got up, we put one foot in front of the other, and we made a little bit of progress. And then I would just make camp wherever I decided. If there was good food for the camels, I'd make camp early. If there wasn't good food for the camels, I'd keep on walking. And I really sort of learnt eventually to just go with the flow, but it took a lot of time.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel like that was like a necessary part of the process?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, looking back on it now, I think that was amazing that I got to have that sort of, that change in my psyche. But it took a bit to sort of to let go of that. We've got to do this many Ks a day. And I think, having the camels, they sort of help with that, because with animals you have to be flexible. You've got 5 other teammates with you, so I guess it's like hiking in a group. You're only as fast as your slowest person, and if someone's not doing well, you can't push them. You have to just take it easy on the team.
Right. Well, I guess to fast forward a little bit, just be on this topic of like the range of emotion. One thing I thought that was so interesting at the end of the book, like really, really interesting to me, is how when you kind of got towards the end of the trip and you're sort of coming back into like more like civilization and there's traffic and this is like, you're sort of coming out of this. I don't know, at that point, maybe, I guess you're 12 and a half months in, and you're used to like being alone in the desert and only seeing like a few people, like one or two people. Now all of a sudden there's like cars and there's all this
Mm.
like, it was so interesting because like my view of what I was reading in that, it was like almost like this parade that was going on, like you bringing the camels through like the streets as
Oh
you're kind of
yeah.
coming to the final stretch. But I'm just like, I sort of, I could feel your anxiety in that. And I don't, maybe I don't know if that was anxiety was the right word, but it seemed like, there was a point where you were kind of coming out of that sort of quiet and solitude back into civilization, and it felt stressful a little bit.
Oh, definitely. And I think about now, like really why I did the trip was to get out there and explore outback Australia.
Yeah.
And to be in those quiet desert places that no one ever, rarely most no Australians visit. We don't have, like you guys have Joshua Tree and you have some big
Yep.
national parks in the deserts. But in Australia, there's actually a lot of Australians that never venture into the heart of Australia. So I loved that idea of being out there, and that was my greatest joy. And but then I had set myself this task of going from A to B. And so then inevitably that was going to mean getting to B, which was coming into more civilized,
Yeah.
built up part of Australia. And I distinctly remember that point where it was almost like I sort of said goodbye to the trip, maybe a month or a month and a half even before the actual end date, because it was kind of like I was saying goodbye to the trip as it as I had loved it and enjoyed it. I remember it was like the last night, before I had sort of friends started joining me, before Jimmy started joining, Jimmy, my now partner, he came along. So it was my last night alone with the camels, and it was this beautiful full moon, and they were grazing, really peacefully. And I knew that from then on, I was going to have people around me. I was going to have trains. I had, busy highways to cross, busy roads. And so I sort of let go of what I had enjoyed so much about the trip then. And then it was kind of like, okay, we need to now just get to the end here, which, like I look back on that now and I think that in itself was a sort of incredible experience. Would I want to do that part again? Never in a million years. Like you said, it was an absolute
It seemed
parade,
hard. Yeah,
Yeah, it was
seemed
really
really
hard,
hard.
like there's, twists and turns in roads and people coming, driving at 80 to 100k an hour, and they don't see, incredibly slow moving camels on the road until, they're right up behind you. And, we're like, when I walked with my camels, we're sort of like the length of a long truck, really. So we take up a huge amount of length and room on the road, and so when cars come up really closely behind, it's terrifying, and people think that they're safe in their little metal box. Well, if you have a big camel come through your windshield, you definitely would not be safe. But it's amazing. People just, and I can't even tell you how many probably car crashes we almost caused by just everyone having their phones out filming me as they drove past, and then, accidentally almost veering into you as they're filming you with their phone,
Yeah.
because we were just such a novel sight, I guess.
It's so interesting because like as I just think back about like my experience as a reader, like yeah, obviously heading out into the outback, into the deserts of Australia, like it sounds scary, it sounds stressful, but like the most stressful part of the book for me was that finish when we're back in civilization.
Yeah,
It's just
civilization, definitely.
yeah,
I agree. Me too.
it's so interesting. So a couple other things about the trip. I'm curious. Just the word beauty keeps coming to me because I'm just sure that like when you're crossing Australia from the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, there's just an expanse of different experiences that you must have had where you just experienced awe and beauty. And I just
Mm,
wonder if there are like one or two things that come to mind
mm.
that really struck you as just like, wow.
Oh, definitely. Well, I guess, yeah, like I said, a lot of the time people will visualize deserts as that sort of Sahara, emptiness. But there's actually a real variety in the landscape out there. And, from the rolling red sand dunes, and then you get what are called gibber plains, which are kind of
Mhm.
like a red rock, and they all squish down on this sort of clay into what looks like a mass of tiles almost. And they can stretch on as far as the eye can see. Like it's amazing. I've never been in such a landscape that is just so just infinite, to the point, and with nothing on there, not a tree in sight, not a bush in sight. It's like you can almost see like the curvature of the earth. um
Wow.
it does something to your psyche having that much space. But also the night sky, at nighttime
Yeah.
is just absolutely amazing. Just the immense amount of stars, and you really feel when you start to go into the deepest part of the desert, because you don't realize actually how much light pollution makes a difference. I mean, obviously we realize that in a city, you can't see as many stars, but when you go out, I was fairly remote from the get-go, but when you're in those wide open landscapes, there's still always, a small town. You can see a little bit of light in the distance from that town. But when I got out into the true desert, it was just a blackness, like almost like a tangible blackness. It was just um, sort of terrifying and also amazing to be in that inky blackness, and but the stars above, absolutely amazing, and just the peace of that landscape. Yeah, and the silence is incredible.
I know you were, as we were kind of talking about this podcast, you were kind of looking back through some old journals. And I guess I'm just curious, like, do you recall any sort of moments along the trip where you like really felt like a deep connection to just the surroundings and nature? And do you remember any like specific moments?
Mm. There was definitely the second part of the journey. I sort of felt like I actually thought that I was coming out of most of the desert country, and I thought that I had left that behind. And I thought I was sort of knew I was heading towards civilization. I was back in these sort of vast cattle stations, but then I went through an area called the Bullagree, and it was the runoff of a sort of major river system that created this big, um, I don't want to say swamp, because not a swamp in a traditional sense, but a big sort of swampy areas, and then with dunes in between. It and it shocked me because it was kind of all of a sudden this extra bit of desert and dunes that I hadn't been expecting. And it was on someone's, yeah, I guess it was the southern end of someone's property, but it was an area that you'd never use it as a pastoral area. You'd never use it for running cattle or sheep or anything, because it's just not very good land, really. And so it was pure. It was like no one ever went out there. And yeah, it was just these rolling, not so red, the sand dunes there, but these light colored sand dunes. And I I think I was that far along in the trip at that point that it was, yeah, I was really kind of starting to feel very in tune with the landscape.
Yeah.
And I was doing the shortest number of Ks per day. I just didn't want to leave. I just wanted to sort of potter around,
Yeah, I
for a
love it.
little bit next day, and then pull up at camp. I'd pull up at camp at like lunchtime a lot of the time, and spend, the whole afternoon just letting my camels graze and just wandering around after them, and just sort of, immersing myself in that. And I went quite a few, because it was such a sort of randomly remote area. I went quite a few weeks without seeing anyone.
Yeah.
And I really sort of sunk into that. You start to, when you don't see anyone for a while, it's like you start to become part of the wilderness around you, and you're just sort of only with your animals. And yeah, so you sort of become one with that, and your whole system slows down. And yeah, so that was a really special experience.
So I love that you just went there, because I wanted to ask you next just about being solo, being alone as a human for such a long period of time. You just mentioned like a couple of weeks just completely on your own. Like, what do you think about,
Mm,
like,
mm.
what is that like mentally?
Mm. Yeah, well, like I said, like your system just seems to sort of slow down in a way. And when you're walking with camels, they walk incredibly slowly. They're much slower than a horse. They're much slower even than people walking. So you really have to slow your pace to match theirs. And there's something about that sort of method of going through the landscape that gives you time to really sort of look around you and observe the minute details in the
Yeah.
land. And I think that's something as well in the Australian outback. It's, there's a lot of beauty in those details. There's a lot of strange little plants that you start to look at daily, or little tracks in the sand from tiny marsupials that have come out at nighttime, or little lizards crossing the dune. So I started to observe a lot of that stuff. And I think that also made me, that in turn then fed into that feeling of being really in tune with the land. Um, and also just I think it almost makes your memory better. I was thinking the other day, you have generally day to day, we're sort of rushing through life. There's a lot going on, and you forget this or that. You forget where you put your car keys. You do things automatically, and it's because our minds are so busy. And I
Right.
think when you're doing that kind of just, I don't know, it's almost like meditative walking, I guess.
Absolutely.
Your mind just slows down, and I started remembering all these things that I hadn't in years. And I mean, nothing hugely sort of revolutionary, but it was just remembering back to different times with friends, various friends that I had, remembering moments that I had shared with people across my life. And then at night when I got in my swag, just dreaming vividly,
Mhm.
I don't know whether it's something to do with being connected, to the ground or the earth, but I would just have the most vivid dreams.
Yeah.
So even though I was sort of alone out there in the desert, it was like I was conjuring up all these different people that had come, that I'd crossed paths with in my life, and sort of bringing them out there with me.
Well, so I love that you talked about it being sort of a meditative state, because I was thinking about that. I mean, I think in city life, like in our busy lives, like mine is just incessant, and it's constantly going. And
Mm,
like, we tried meditation to like hopefully practice learning to slow things down. And it sounds like this was just sort of like a natural way to slow down your
mm. Yeah, and I mean, I didn't realize it. I didn't go into doing that trip to sort of do a 13-month long meditation or
Yeah.
anything, but it was just sort of the consequence of being
Yeah.
out there with the camels. And yeah, they're such, peaceful animals to be
Yeah.
around, when they're at times there was definitely unpeaceful moments as well, but generally, when they're grazing contentedly, it's a really sort of grounding feeling.
Yeah, and I wanna go to the camels next, but just real quick on this meditation piece, because I think there might be like a learning moment for all of us, like this 13-month journey that was like, you slowed things down, you're walking with the land, and you noticed, and didn't even plan it, but you noticed the impact of like mind slowing down. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, for those of us living those busy lives that can't take 13 months to go walk across a country, like, is there like an alternative? Is there like another way to like disconnect for a short period of time to step into that slowing down?
Yeah, I mean, my advice probably now, having done what I've done, would be just to be in nature, and to really observe everything in nature as much as you can, because we just switch off from that these days. Um, and there's so much. I spend time these days where I'll lie out in the grass, and and I'll look at the tiny little bugs that might be sort of in the grass, and so on. Like, it's really peaceful. And any being around any animal too, I think has a very sort of grounding,
Yeah.
peaceful feeling. So that would be my advice. I mean, there is definitely something therapeutic about that, about walking, I think,
Yeah.
that daily moving forward. So, for me, just any time walking in nature has always given me that slowed down my mind, and that peacefulness.
Yeah. So, Sophie, you did this as a human solo, but you weren't alone. You had 5 companions.
Yeah,
And
that's it.
I really do want to kind of talk about that dynamic. Like there was, so you, and also with, you had a lot of human connection along the way as well. A lot of people that kind of popped in and out to see you and help you. But I want to talk about the camels for a little bit. Like, what was that like? What was that like in terms of your connection with them, the companionship? Like in the beginning, you were talking about like having anxiety and talking out loud. And I was thinking to myself, is she talking to herself or is she talking to the camels? I'm curious, like what your interactions were with the camels as your companions.
Oh, I think I spent 13 months just talking to the camels. Like people would ask me along the way, they'd be like, "Oh, do you speak to your camels?" I'm like, "Yeah, of course." I feel like it would be weird if I didn't. Like for me, they became my best friends out
Yeah.
there. And I never, I don't know how I'd go actually if I decided to walk across Australia with a cart or on a bike. It would be a much more lonely experience. I did have like weeks when I was on my own, but it was, as you said, always with 5 traveling companions.
Yeah.
So they really, they all had their individual personalities. And it was so lovely because I took them from the wild. I got to see that evolve. They came to me as, wild animals, and as I put the training in, you start to see the different personalities with them. And not one size of training doesn't fit all. You've got to train them a little bit differently depending as to who each of them are. So yeah, that was great. And yeah, probably, one of my biggest joys. But I mean, traveling with animals also does have its, challenges for sure. There was a lot of worry constantly about, because it wasn't just my safety and my well-being. I was constantly thinking about their safety and their well-being. So there was a lot of worry that went into that. Were they eating enough? How thirsty they were when we'd got out into those desert areas. But they progressed massively. Like I said, when we first set off, they were so spooky, and everything would terrify them. And I spent hours every single day. It wasn't relaxing one bit. I'd pull into camp and I would unpack them for the day, and then I would basically let them off in what are called hobbles, which are little sort of cufflinks that go between their 2 front legs. And all that does is just restricts their movement so they can't gallop basically away from me. But they can still move huge distances in those, kilometers in those little hobbles, shuffling along. And because they were so terrified at the beginning, they just wanted to get out of there. They didn't even want to eat because they were just so stressed and scared. Camels really love being able to see the horizon. They love open space. They're desert animals in that way. So when I was in really wooded areas, which a lot of sort of the beginning of WA was, then they felt like they couldn't see out. So they were sort of constantly trying to sort of get beyond this thick sort of scrubby wooded country that we were in. And so then I would have walked all day, been hot walking all day. I would have loaded 500 kilos on their back. Then I would have walked all day. Then I would have unloaded them. And then when I just wanted to sit down at camp and have a cup of tea, I'd be then chasing them around the bush, trying to keep track of my camels so that I didn't lose them in this maze of country. So, so there was a lot of work that goes in. There was times for sure at that point where I thought, oh, I wish I just was on a bike and I could just get off the bike and the bike would just stay right there and I could sit down and have a cup of tea. But no, you're running after camels. So yeah, there's definitely its challenges. But slowly, as I think as we all relaxed, the camels and myself, then they started grazing more peacefully. They started grazing around camp. I wouldn't have to walk so far with them. I mean, that came and went, but and then they started, progressing just in their ability to be able to cope with so many new challenges, and especially like when we got towards the East Coast, and there was all that traffic to deal with and people to deal with, and, you know, people wanting to pat them and in their faces, and, you know, kids, and all these new experiences for them, to the point where at the end, you know, we were taking them to a pub with live music on a Sunday session, you know, with cars parked everywhere and kids everywhere, and you know, and they just stood and chewed their cud, and they were perfectly well behaved, and it was amazing to think that, you know, they were once wild animals.
That's so fun. What was the like connection like between you and the camels, I guess, as a whole? But I'd also love to hear, like, if you could tell us about each of the 5 camels briefly, because I think that would be really fun for listeners.
Oh yeah. So I'll go down the string order. That'll be easier. So the camels basically are linked one to the other in what's called a string, so a big long line. So, you know, the camel in front is towing the camel behind, and the one behind that, and so on. So my lead camel was Jude, and Jude, who was, you know, I don't want to say that you have favorites, but he was definitely my favorite. He was just such a lovable lunatic. He is just goofy. It was kind of like he almost had split personality. Sometimes he would be just the most chilled out dude, and the next thing he would be nuts, and he would be trying to spook at things, and it was almost like he'd communicate with the other camels like, guys, there's a car coming, does everyone know there's a car coming? Let's freak out now, there's a car coming. You know, and he would have seen 100 cars by this point, and it's like he still never got over it. But he was just, I was always so mad, and probably through the book there was a lot of F Jude. You know, there's a lot of my frustration with Jude throughout the whole book, but I never stayed angry at him, just because he was, you know, he was just so funny. He was just absolutely so funny. I only had one female camel, Delilah, and she, I always kind of describe her like we'd have a professional relationship, you know, but we wouldn't go out for drinks after work.
Okay.
But female camels, she actually right towards the end ended up becoming my lead camel. And because girls do make good leaders, and she was just a little bit more level-headed than Jude, and she sort of managed to keep the boys in line. She was a bit older. She was the oldest camel. And then next I had Charlie and Clayton. They were my youngest boys, and they were kind of opposite ends of the spectrum personality wise. Clayton, it was almost like I almost describe him a bit like he has camel Asperger's. He likes routine, loves everything done in a routine way. Don't try and touch him, don't try and pat him. He's not really interested in affection, but he's the smartest camel there. But as long as you keep everything, you know, so he understands it in a routine and he doesn't have a meltdown. Whereas then Charlie, he's the most lovable camel out there. You know, he'd lay his head in your lap, you know, you could pat him for hours. The kids loved Charlie. And then Mac was at the back of the string, and he was the most handsome camel. He was kind of captain of the football club.
Nice.
Yeah, and him and Delilah they had a bit of a thing going on.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so that's the sort of dynamics of the herd.
I mean, I'm curious. The subtitle of the book includes love, adventure, and finding your own path. Is the Mac Delilah? Is this the love part?
Oh, you know, I would love to. I could write a whole book on that. A whole another book on that.
We may come back to that question. So where are the camels today now that you're finished?
So they live out in the Flinders Ranges,
Okay.
on a friend's property out there, loving their retirement, overly fat and happy. Yeah.
That's amazing. Do you go visit them?
Yeah, I do. And I've actually done a few sort of shorter treks afterwards, you know, whenever I can. I still take them out and about, you know, not for a 13-month trip this time, but a week here and there. So, yeah.
So fun. All right. So coming back to the subtitle of your book, It does include love, adventure, and finding your own path. So I'm curious, did you find what you were looking for?
Well, I guess, like, okay, obviously I didn't go out there looking for love, I was never expecting to find love in the vast Australian wilderness, away from anyone. But about midway through the journey, so I guess I should prequel this with, but right before I set off on my trip, I'd just been through a pretty bad breakup. So a lot of the first half of my book talks a bit about, dealing with that. And because I had so much time walking on my own, your thoughts are constantly going back to what has happened in the past. And so I was constantly circling back to that relationship and what had gone wrong and how I had stuffed up. And I felt partly that the trek and the camels and all of that had been the sort of downfall of that relationship, and that had stuffed everything up. So that was really hard. And when times got tough, I kept thinking, like, why am I even out here? Like, what have I given up to do this? And it's, when this is even, it's so tough and it's not enjoyable. And so that was really hard. And then halfway through, I had a total flip. Well, I obviously started to accept, the breakup of that past relationship. And then halfway through, I stopped. Originally, I thought I'd actually do the entire walk in one go. I thought I'd cross Australia in one hit. And I realized pretty early on that was not going to be possible. So I had to walk in the winter months because it's just so hot and dry out there. Summer's impossible to walk in. So I had to break the trip up into two halves, and I had to wait out a summertime and then recommence, the following winter. So I ended up stopping, and I just did the camels at the Flinders Ranges, as you spoke about, which is sort of right a bit further south, but sort of in the centre of Australia. And while the camels were, out roaming in a paddock, and I was about to take 5 months off, I went into a tiny town there. There was only 50 people in this town, and I thought, I have been 3 months out in the desert, no shops or anything. I thought, I'm going to take myself out for a coffee. And I went to the only place that I knew served coffee in that tiny town, and it was a little outback bakery. And I was served by a guy called Jimmy. And basically the rest is history. He ended up, of course, asking about the trip. We had a bit of a summer fling. I thought it would just be a summer fling, and I would walk away into the sunset with my camels and we'd never see one another again. I thought there's no way that, this is going to continue into anything. But Jimmy ended up driving. He was not willing to let me go, basically, and he ended up driving 16,000 kilometres back and forth from his home in the Flinders Ranges to come and see me and the camels while we were out walking. And then became a real critical member of the team right towards the end. As I came into those areas of civilization and, winding roads and fast cars and everything, I finally sort of had to come to terms with the fact that I actually couldn't do the whole thing alone. And I needed some help. Mainly I needed someone to help me navigate the traffic and also to help me, originally at the beginning of the trip, I would contact these station owners or these, ranchers, and I would ask permission to camp on their land. But because the properties are so big, I would only have to contact, a handful of people. But then, as I got closer and the properties became, very small, you had to contact someone, every single day to ask if you could camp out in their paddock. And so I needed help with those logistics as well. And Jimmy came on as basically my full-time logistics guy and traffic coordinator extraordinaire. And
he was amazing. Like, I told you that the last part of the book kind of stressed me out. He was like the calm and the chaos. Like, he just took charge, and like, I loved that. Like, that was awesome. I don't want to give away too much of that story because the book is so good, and I definitely want people to get to it. But this is kind of a funny thing. I mean, it's the first part of your subtitle, but like, would you ever recommend to anybody, hey, if you're looking for love, just go out into the middle of the desert?
I don't think I would recommend that. I think I got very lucky. But I was listening to one of your other podcasts the other day, and someone mentioned how they had met someone on the Appalachian Trail,
Mm,
and yeah, and I just thought, like, adventures are actually such a great way to meet new people, because you're thrust into this, different environment. You're talking to new people. I mean, my book even I never expected to walk across the width of the country, I guess, which is so remote, but then come out with just so many meetings from complete random people. Um, and I think it's a really lovely way of getting out there and meeting, different people that you wouldn't normally meet in your home environment. So,
yeah,
yeah, I think adventures in general are a great way to meet people.
love it. So we covered love. I think it's safe to say the adventure speaks for itself. The last part of your subtitle is about finding your own path. It's about finding purpose. And I'm just curious kind of now that it's all behind you, what your reflections are on that piece. Did you find what you were looking for there?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one, and I come back to that again and again. What I learned from the journey,
Yeah.
and I think it's something as well that you often don't find out until sort of much later on the journey, or until you're sort of reflecting. In the time you're in it, and there's a lot of logistics, that come with traveling. Whether you're doing a trail or anything, you're working out how to get to your next food drop, and how much water you have for the day, and in my case, packing up camels and walking every single day, and then it was working out the logistics at the end of the trip, how to sort of get the camels then we'll work out where the camels were going to live post trip. So I sort of didn't have time at the time to reflect on that. And I, I remember being really annoyed right in those final days, because everyone would say to me, "Oh, how are you feeling? Like, you're about to end the trip. How are you feeling? How are you feeling?" And I remember just thinking, "Oh, if someone asks me again how I'm feeling, I want to scream." Because you're just so focused on the
Yeah.
actual, yeah, on the logistics of reaching that end point, and the emotion of it all, I don't think, has really set in. And now, yeah, now that I've finished, I do often reflect on what it is that I learned from such a journey. Definitely, as we mentioned before, that connection with nature, and that sort of ability to sort of observe the natural world around me. That was such a great thing that I gained. Also, I think my ability to be able to handle uh, like adversity, or tough
Mm, yeah.
situations. I and especially to have to do the journey alone, that sort of gave me that even more so, because I had no one else to rely on. Like, yes, I had the camels out there too, but obviously I'm the team leader, and I'm the only human, and so I'm the one that has to sort of deal with a tough situation. And I really reflected a lot on, while I was out there, how often I had hoped that someone else would fix it for me. I could call someone on the phone, and I could cry to them on the phone, and someone would come and fix it for me. And I suddenly realized, when I was out there and shit hit the fan, that no one was coming to save me, and no one was coming to rescue me, and no one was coming to make me move forward except myself. I was the only one that could make myself, pack the camels up the next day and keep on moving forward. And so that determination, yeah, was a real gain. And also learning, I think, in that process as well, I learned a lot about compartmentalizing, and
Mm,
just breaking everything into bite-sized pieces, because in the early days it was overwhelming to think, oh my, I've got to reach the other side of the country. It was too much to even fathom. So I started to break things down into, okay, I just need to reach the next water point where I'm going to give my camels a drink. Or some days it was even less. Like, I just need to reach this afternoon's camp,
yeah.
wherever that is, and just that breaking it down into the simple things. And really, adventures, I think, are all about that. It's just breaking it down into those simple things of life, that surviving, with what you have around you. on your own in the wilderness, you know, that getting up every morning, you know, putting that pack on your back or that pack on your animals and just moving forward and to the next campsite.
So I think that's such good, like simple, practical advice that makes great sense. You are an incredibly strong and courageous woman that has like clearly proven that your ability to like accomplish whatever you want. And I'm just curious, like, this is such an epic journey that you've taken. There probably are people that see it as so epic, like I could never do that. Right. And I guess I'm just curious what advice you would have for people that might have those thoughts.
Yeah, and I thought a lot about that because I did have a lot of people say, oh, I could never do what you're doing. And I remember thinking like, well, yeah, you could. You know, like I didn't grow up with camels around me.
Yeah.
You know, like you mentioned right at the beginning, I worked in film and TV, so I didn't have any previous experience with camels. I didn't grow up hiking or camping in the outdoors. Even my parents weren't campers. I did a lot of travel when I was young, but so I always sort of had that, you know, desire to explore and those itchy feet. But I was I was a hopeless camper, you know. So it's amazing if you want to do it, what you can learn, you know. And I think as well, I really thought it's all about time. Like you just have to give yourself the time, you know. And a lot of people don't do that. They sort of think, oh, well, I won't be able to go and do that tomorrow. Well, yeah, you won't be able to go and do that tomorrow. But if you really want to do it and you give yourself the time to learn those skills, you will be able to do it. You know, I I think often like you know, when I first went out there, it was actually my ex-boyfriend that I broke up with before the trip. He sort of got me into a lot of that camp. He was ex-army. He got me into a lot of that camping and outdoors stuff. And my first experience of it was actually going and doing. I decided we'd done a number of we'd started to do a number of sort of hikes together, and then I decided that I wanted to do a solo hike on my own. So I organized to do this 9-day trip on my own, and I suddenly realized like I don't know anything. I didn't know how to put up, you know, barely knew how to put up a tent, didn't know how to put up a shelter, wasn't very good at lighting a fire. I thought like, what do you even do if you need to go to the toilet in the bush? Like, didn't know anything. So I went from those 9 days basically into my 13 months with the camels. So it's amazing what you can, you know, what you can learn if you've just got to give yourself, I think, like I said,
Yeah.
the time and the patience and the, you know, and the persistence really.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you for that. What are you working on now? Is there anything that listeners can help you with?
Oh, now life looks a bit different. I'm actually now back on the east coast of Australia, which is where I'm from originally. So totally different environment to the desert, very, you know, green rolling hills out here. I've taken on a farm. So I'm actually I'm a terrible commitment phobe. You know, I've been a gypsy my whole life. I've moved around to different countries. I've always, you know, like I said, had those itchy feet. So this is a very new thing for me to try a sense of staying in one spot and having a home. Very daunting at the same time, but it's been fun. Yeah, where I think from the camel trek, I really loved as well visiting all these different property owners and learning how they farmed and learning, you know, how they cared for the landscape on the way. And so that's been my latest passion is really looking at you know, how I can through farming and through agriculture and through just, you know, being a custodian of this land, look at, you know, how I can help heal, you know, this landscape that I'm on now, but then also still keep the adventures rolling into. They might just be slightly shorter ones, not 13-month ones right now, but there's
Absolutely.
always some longer ones planned for the future.
I love it. Well, listen, there are so many things that we didn't get to touch on. The book is amazing. I encourage listeners to get a copy. How can people get a copy of the book?
Yeah, so it's available in the States now. So if you really go in, I love supporting little local bookshops. You know, I think it's tough for them to make money. So if you can, I'd highly recommend just going into your local bookshop, asking them to order it in. As you said, it's called The Crossing. My name's Sophie Matterson, and got a camel and me on the cover. So there's probably not that many other books that have camels on the cover. But yeah, I'd get them to order one in, or, you know, if you want to, you can go online and order it online. You can go onto my website, which is www.sophiematterson, my full name.com. And yeah, you can order a signed copy and I'll post it out to you wherever you are.
Awesome. I love that. You know, I think before I close out on the book, like the one comment that I did want to make about the book is, you know, this sounds like, and I suspect, you know, you spent so much time alone, but there's so much in the book that involves relationship with other people, like so many people that you met along the way. I mean, the book is loaded with stories of people that you encountered along the way that were willing to help. And like, we didn't really get a lot of time to kind of dive into that today, but that's one of the things I just wanted to comment on. Like, that was such a fun part of the book to see you be able to have those interactions.
Oh, there's some characters out there in the outback. You know, a lot of people get scared to go out there, and, you know, there's been some, I don't know, for some reason they become notorious, you know, outback murders. And so everyone sort of gets very creeped out about these places. But, you know, there's so many amazing, funny, interesting characters. I really learned to never judge a book by its cover, because, yeah, there's some weird and wonderful people out there that have made my life a lot richer.
Love it. Well, please get a copy of The Crossing, a memoir of love, adventure, and finding your own path. Sophie Matterson, this has been so much fun. Listen, this story is so epic. And whether it's about the book or maybe even your next adventure, at some point, you know, Hollywood is going to find out about all this. They're going to want to make a movie about you. And I want to know.
Only if people keep buying books. So
that's right.
If everyone keeps buying books, then maybe.
They're going to make a movie. I want to know when they do, who's going to be the Hollywood actress that's going to play you in your movie?
Oh, so you did warn me about this question, and I did think a lot about it. For some reason, you know what? For some reason, Reese Witherspoon just keeps coming up, but I think that's only because the movie Wild, and, you know, I loved Cheryl Strayed's book. You know, I read that, so, you know, I made notes all through that as I was writing my own. I loved her writing, so that's the only reason why that just sort of keeps jumping in mind. But I think, to be honest, I'd probably like just a very unknown Australian actress. Okay. There's a little part of me that sort of goes, "Ooh, could you do that yourself?" You know, like, I never expected to write a book. Could I act in my own movie? Obviously, it would have to be made very soon.
That's your next adventure. I think you're starring in your own movie. I love it. I think you're starring.
But I was also thinking, you know, it's not for me like who would play me. It's more about who would play my camels. You know, would Mac play Mac, or would would Charlie play Charlie? That's a big question too.
You think they can handle it?
I think they can handle it. I think they're ready for the challenge.
Sophie, what's the movie going to be called?
Look, there was another, you know, famous book by Robin Davidson called Tracks, and she did a trip in the 70s from Alice Springs to the coast of Western Australia, and then they released a movie by the same title, Tracks. Yeah. And so I think I sort of like the idea of it just being the same as the book, The Crossing.
I love it. The Crossing. Yeah. I love it. It's going to be an Oscar winner. I am going to run to the theater to watch that movie. It's going to be amazing.
Thanks, Scott.
Sophie, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. For those listening, I hope you've been inspired today as much as I have. I hope Sophie's story has encouraged you to listen to the voice inside that calls you to adventure, because we want to hear your story next. If you have a story to tell or just need a nudge to create one, please send me an email. We'd also appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word by leaving a review and sharing or tagging Inspire Campfire in your social media. And until next time, I want to encourage you to get outside. Thanks for listening. Sophie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been so much fun.